America turned 250 in 2026, and one of the most recognizable aircraft in the U.S. Air Force entered the year with what looked like a very clear future: retirement. The plan was unusually direct. The Air Force wanted to divest all 162 of its remaining A-10s during fiscal year 2026. Not slowly over the rest of the decade, not after another major modernization cycle. All of them. For an aircraft that has survived retirement debates for decades, this looked different. This looked final. And despite some dramatic headlines online, there was no newly announced A-10X arriving to save the story. The aircraft at the center of this debate was still the A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog. An airplane whose production ended in 1984. Think about that for a moment. The last new A-10 was built more than 4 decades ago. Yet in 2026, the argument over when America should finally stop flying it was still not finished. That tells you something important about the A-10. Its story has never been only about the airplane. It has always been about the mission behind it. The A-10 came from a very different military era. It was built around close air support, durability, long presence near supported forces, and the ability to operate in demanding conditions. Its unusual shape became instantly recognizable. Its massive cannon became even more famous. But the gun is not the reason the A-10's 2026 story matters. The real story is what happens when an old aircraft still has useful work to do, while the institution operating it is already preparing for a different future. And the Air Force has real reasons for wanting to move on. An airplane does not become cheaper simply because people love it. Old fleets need maintenance. They need spare parts. They need trained pilots. They need instructors. They need maintainers. They need engine support. They need facilities. They need money and people that could otherwise move into newer missions. And the environments the Air Force expects to face in future high-end conflicts are not necessarily the same environments that made the A-10 famous. So the retirement argument is not simply about whether the Warthog can still do anything useful. Of course it can. The harder question is whether maintaining the entire system around it remains the best use of limited resources. That distinction matters, because the Air Force is not trying to retire the A-10 because it hates the airplane. It is trying to move people, money, maintenance capacity, and training toward the missions it believes will matter more in the future. The problem is that useful missions do not always disappear on the same schedule as modernization plans. And in 2026, that problem became impossible to ignore. At Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, the end was already becoming real. For decades, the base had been deeply connected to the A-10 community. Pilots trained there. Maintainers supported the aircraft there. Generations of airmen built careers around the Warthog there. Then the milestones started arriving. In March 2026, the final class of A-10 Formal Training Unit students completed its mission qualification training at Davis-Monthan. That was not a proposal. It happened. A major piece of the pipeline that had produced new A-10 pilots was reaching its end. Then came another milestone. In May, Davis-Monthan completed its final A-10 engine build. Another part of the support system was closing. Training was ending. Engine work was ending. The retirement machinery was no longer theoretical. It was happening in real buildings, to real units, with real people, already moving toward whatever came next. If the story ended there, the conclusion would be easy. The A-10 was finally leaving. Except that while one part of the Air Force was preparing to close the Warthog chapter, A-10s were appearing somewhere very different, over the U.S. Central Command area of responsibility, during Operation Epic Fury. Official imagery from March 2026 showed A-10s operating during the campaign. One was photographed refueling in the air. Other official imagery showed an A-10 departing for a mission. And suddenly the retirement story became much more complicated, because the aircraft the Air Force planned to remove from its inventory was still being used on a real-world operation. That proves something, but probably not what the most dramatic Warthog headlines would have you believe. It does not prove the A-10 suddenly belongs in every future conflict. It does not prove every concern about an aging fleet was wrong. And it does not prove that a decades-old aircraft has somehow escaped the technological changes reshaping air warfare. What it proves is narrower and more interesting. The A-10 still had work to do. That is enough to create a serious planning problem. What do you do with an aircraft that is still useful while the system supporting it is already being dismantled? That question became even harder when the retirement timeline changed. By May 2026, Air Combat Command was publicly saying that some A-10s were planned to remain in service until 2030 at Moody Air Force Base in Georgia and Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. That is a major change from the original plan to divest all 162 remaining aircraft during fiscal year 2026. But be careful with what that means. The A-10 was not resurrected. The retirement was not simply canceled. The entire fleet was not suddenly guaranteed 4 more years. Instead, part of the fleet received more time while the broader drawdown continued. And nowhere was that contradiction more visible than Davis-Monthan. On July 29, 2026, the A-10 completed its final flight at the base. Airmen and members of the local community gathered to watch an aircraft that had been part of Davis-Monthan for nearly 5 decades close its chapter there. So think about where the Warthog stood by the middle of 2026. At one base, the final training class was complete. The final engine had been built. The final flight had happened. Yet elsewhere, some A-10s were now expected to continue flying until 2030. The Warthog was still leaving, just not everywhere. And that may be the best way to understand what is really happening. This is not a comeback story. It is a transition story. The Air Force is trying to move beyond the A-10 while still extracting useful service from part of the fleet. Those two things can happen at the same time. And the aircraft itself has not completely stopped evolving either. Even this late in its service life, official Air Force budget material shows the A-10 remaining connected to efforts aimed at countering unmanned aircraft. That does not transform the Warthog into some new futuristic platform. It does reveal something about how military technology actually changes. Old aircraft do not always disappear the moment a new problem arrives. Sometimes their missions change first. Sometimes new equipment gets integrated. Sometimes an aircraft built for one era survives long enough to face problems its original designers could never have expected. The mission changed faster than the airframe did. But that creates another problem. Keeping an airplane on a schedule until 2030 is one thing. Keeping the ecosystem around that airplane healthy until 2030 is another. An aircraft does not stay alive because someone changes a retirement date. It stays alive because pilots remain qualified, maintainers remain experienced, parts remain available, engines remain supportable, training remains effective, facilities remain capable, and enough people remain inside the system to make all of those pieces work together. Some of that infrastructure is already shrinking. That means every additional year becomes an increasingly careful balancing act. How much capability is still useful? How much does it cost to preserve? How many people should remain attached to it? And when does keeping an old capability begin making the transition to the next one harder? There is no simple answer. That is why the two sides of the A-10 argument can both contain some truth. Supporters look at an aircraft that is still flying missions and ask why something useful should disappear before its usefulness reaches zero. Air Force planners look at an aging fleet, shrinking infrastructure, future threats, and limited resources and ask how long modernization can be delayed. Neither question is ridiculous. And 2026 did not settle the argument. It made the argument more interesting because the Air Force entered the year with a plan to eliminate the remaining fleet. Then A-10s flew during a real operation overseas. Some aircraft received a path toward 2030. And at the same time, Davis-Monthan still said goodbye. That is why saying the Warthog simply defeated retirement misses the point. It did not. Retirement is happening. Training ended at Davis-Monthan. Engine work ended there. The final flight happened. The support system is changing. But part of the fleet still has work ahead. The A-10 is not alive because somebody discovered a secret new version of the aircraft. There is no magical A-10X rewriting everything we know about air power. The real story is more grounded than that, and in some ways, much more fascinating. The United States is trying to retire a capability without giving up useful capacity too early. That is a problem much larger than the Warthog. Every military eventually faces it. When does something old become too old? When does replacement become more important than remaining utility? And what happens when the future is not ready at exactly the same moment the past is supposed to leave? The A-10 has become a flying version of those questions. America's 250th anniversary will pass. The Warthog debate apparently will not. So what do you think? If a legacy aircraft still has useful missions to fly, should the Air Force keep it longer while newer capabilities and industrial capacity catch up? Or does extending an aging fleet only make modernization harder? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if you enjoy fact-based stories about military aviation, defense technology, and the aircraft shaping America's future air power, hit the like button and subscribe to Defense TV. Because the A-10 is still serving, still shrinking, and still not quite gone. The A-10's last chapter has already started. Nobody seems to know exactly how long that chapter will be.